Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Stijn, Renneboog, Secretary General at Eurovent. Few organisations in Europe bridge the gap between policy and practice more effectively than Eurovent. Stijn, in his role in the organisation, has an almost unique perspective of the interplay between slow-moving legislative instruments like the Energy Performance of Building Directives and how these are translated on the ground through industry. As you will hear, Eurovent covers an enormous amount of ground in the organisations it represents and the industry and jurisdictions it covers. We talked about the progress of sustainability, directives and policy through the lens of Europe, but also what this means for the sector and importantly how occupants and users of spaces will see this manifest over the coming years. We touched on new markets, circularity and embodied carbon and a lot more besides. It's always a pleasure to talk with the very knowledgeable Stijn, and a conversation that's a great window into the progress of the sector more broadly. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Stijn, Renneboog. From a European perspective, the built environment clearly is trying to grapple with immense pressure of decarbonisation. You know, we see this from a legislative end of things all the way into the supply chain at this stage. But we're also seeing at the same time what I get a sense is a rebalancing from this kind of ideal of the green transition and having to reconcile with the realities of things like the need for affordable housing, energy security, new technology disruptions like AI and data centers. There's this huge energy conversation happening in parallel to the decarbonisation strategy. You might perceive that as a kind of a loss of momentum in some way, but the European bloc is such a complex bloc. There's so much going on at any one time. I thought it'd be a really good place to start to get kind of your sense of where you think as a whole the sector is at the moment on this kind of decarbonisation journey.
Yeah, well, I think, as you mentioned, I think it's there's maybe a tension or a perceived tension between, on the one hand, the need to decarbonize the building stock. So buildings account for something like 40% of energy use in the EU and something like 36% of carbon emissions. So if we have any hope of achieving sort of a net zero future, then the building stock is an important part of the puzzle, let's say. But on the other hand, there's also an issue with affordability of housing. If you look at statistics like what proportion of income people spend on housing, whether it's mortgage or rent, it keeps going up and up. We see that home ownership rates, especially among the younger people, are going down. And so there's also this political pressure to build more housing and to make housing affordable. And they are sometimes perceived to be in conflict with one another. I'm not sure that's actually the case necessarily. I don't see like a fundamental reason why a sustainable built environment can't be affordable as well. But there's, I suppose, the question of where the money is going to come from and what the political priorities are, and whether all of these requirements about energy and carbon, whether that's not just red tape that creates uncertainty in the market and prevents us from building new. But if you look at the market statistics, the truth is that we don't really build all that much housing. If you look at like how many new permits for construction are granted, also if you look at statistics in the HVAC sector specifically, of course there are growth markets here and there, but in general I would say that we are not building the way that we were used to, and there are other geographies in China, in India, where they are building like crazy, and that's something that we don't do anymore. And you see a lot of political focus on that, on what we can do to change that. And so I'll just give you one example at the European level. We used to have a commissioner for energy, and now it's been renamed. It's now a commissioner for energy and housing. And one of his mandates is to find out how we can build more affordable housing. So yeah, that's I would say a little bit the tension that we see at the moment is between decarbonization and the need for new and affordable housing.
Yeah, and I suppose the risk is the headline is that in some way the process of decarbonisation is slowing down that need, but it seems to me there's a lot of other drivers that impact that, skills and labour being one of the primary ones. Obviously, every time I think I look at this, it's the same kind of report that we've got a lack of engineers and a lack of labour force, and it is quite a mobile labour force, so it tends to migrate around where the work is, and it's once you lose it, it's very difficult to get that labour force back. So I think most countries are struggling. That's what I find hard. The conversations I have with people is that on the surface, at the macroeconomic level, all the lights are green. Look, what a market needs is demand primarily, and there's this huge demand for housing. Yet somehow we don't seem to be able to get out from our own feet and build at the scale we need to. Undoubtedly, we have to build more intelligently than we have in the past. We'll talk about it later. Things like embodied carbon have to be part of that conversation. We can't just pour concrete until it's coming out of our ears anymore. Like that those times have gone. But nonetheless, when you look at the market, you would think on the surface level that like all lights are a go really for construction of housing. Yet somehow an island where I am is exactly the same. We seem to be stuck at about 25,000 homes per year in a country that needs probably 40 or 50,000 homes a year sustainably for a decade in order to catch up. And we just can't get there. We seem to be hitting these glass ceilings of production in housing that we can't seem to break through.
Yeah, no, I think what you mentioned is important because the barriers, I think, are complex. There's not like a simple fix for how we can build more. I think there are certainly political forces that point to red tape and the fact that you have to do a lot of environmental impact assessments, etc., before you can start construction. And that might be part of it. But I think there, as you mentioned, also it's the skills. We don't have the qualified people to build, especially the trades, right? The skilled professions that are necessary. I think there's not like a simple solution to this problem.
I think the risk is in this period of time where there's a plateau in construction at the very least, off even a decline in some areas, that we see a loss of momentum in the sustainability movement, in the idea that we need to build sustainable homes. There was a lot of momentum pre-pandemic towards sustainability, a lot of work being done at a European level on things like the energy performance of building directives. The sense from the outside, and that's what started my conversation with you about this when we spoke weeks ago about this, was that the feeling is that momentum has evaporated in some way. There's a lot of flurry of activity at a kind of a legislative level, at a European level, around the energy performance of building directives, a lot of the EN standards that were supporting them. And all of a sudden, it seems to be a bit quiet in that sense. But you were saying it's entering a different phase. There's a kind of we're into a new phase of the implementation of these kind of standards, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think maybe there's a perception in some sectors that it was too much all at once. So the European Commission came out with the European Green Deal, and what's called the Fit for 55 package. So that's, let's say, a revision of all legislation that has something to do with carbon emissions in order to align it with the goal to reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2030, which is already in 5 years' time. And there was so much legislative activities and so many different pieces of legislation that were being proposed or reviewed, including the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And the industry had to digest all of this, right? And then once we have the legislation, it doesn't end there, right? As you say, you have to implement the standards. A lot of this has to be transposed at national level. You need to develop the kind of competencies in the industry. If you have to make changes, for example, in the HVAC industry, you have to bring new products to market that meet the new demand for energy efficiency or that use low GWP refrigerants or whatever it might be. There's also a process there of innovation and bringing the product to market and testing it. And I think it was maybe there's a perception that it was too much, and that the industry is still struggling to sort of understand what happened and to digest everything. And I think it created a backlash, because what we see now is a lot of political forces that are pushing for what's called simplification. So they want to go back over everything that was done in the previous mandate to see if we can sort of simplify it, that maybe it was too much and we created too many constraints. And so there's I think that the energy performance of buildings is no exception. There are countries, there are member states that are asking the European Commission to reopen the EPBD, to change it, because they think that what was changed in the previous mandate was too much, it's too complex. The market cannot meet the goals that are specified in the EPBD. And it's all a little bit up in the air. And the thing is, these conversations, I think it shows that it's a little bit more polarizing than perhaps it was in the last mandate. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Simon, but in Germany, the last government, the coalition fell over the National Energy Performance Act, the Gebäudeenergiegesetz, so that's, let's say, the German version of the EPBD. It turned out to be so polarizing that the government fell and they had to hold elections, and a new government came in. Is there a loss of momentum? I think so. I think that there has been a backlash to the sustainability push from certain industries, but I think also there's just a lot of work that has to be done, and it's perhaps less visible, right? It's work that's happening in the standardization realm in the industry, at the national level, implementing the EPBD.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think there's two parts to what you're saying there that's interesting. One is that when these big documents come out, like the Energy Performance of Building Directives, they're always there's no such thing as a perfect document, and there's always going to be revisions, and people will always have problems with elements of it. It's this kind of, that's the reality of by consensus. These things are hard. It's like democracy, right? It's just a constant evolution. What's been fascinating to me is you realize quite how on the line what we've taken for granted over the last half a decade or so of the direction of travel for things like sustainability, a couple of changes in government and sentiment at national levels, you realize that these are fine margins actually, and often these big directional shifts can happen. You know, what we thought was a pretty stable direction of travel for things like standards around sustainability, all of a sudden we're much less sure-footed about that than we were, and I think that's been surprising to a lot of people. There's just been an assumption that that's the way we were going and we're getting on with it, and in the space of a year and a half, we've seen a pretty, like most countries now, there's a lot, the voices from the margins are much louder than they've ever been.
It's also because we're in a different world, right? A lot happened when the European Green Deal was first sort of put to paper in 2019, 2020. I mean, a lot has happened since then, right? We had the COVID pandemic. We had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which had impacts on energy prices, because obviously we imported a lot of our natural gas from Russia. We saw a lot of inflation, interest rates are rising, and so we live in a completely different reality. And I think that also causes people, I suppose, to reflect on their priorities and maybe think a little bit differently about, is this the right way? Should we focus solely on sustainability, or are there other things that we should think about as well, especially when people are struggling and they can't afford housing, and the price of everything goes up.
Yeah, and then geopolitics shifts dramatically, at the same time. It really is unsettling. At the same time, and I think what's really interesting for an organization like yours, you sit in that interface between these changes and industry at the coalface. And there's this relentless progression of industry that requires to happen regardless of what's going on elsewhere. So you see that dynamic in real time, don't you, as a representative organization of industry? You and I have both seen it over the last decade. Big enterprise size organizations starting to wrap their head around sustainability, circularity, fitting in with energy performance directives and EN standards. And, a lot of time and effort has gone into understanding this direction of travel. Those wheels don't stop turning, do they? In the time frames of political cycles, industry needs certainty, and it's ploughing on regardless often.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, what matters, let's say in the most fundamental sense for a company is there a customer to buy my product? And the market demand for sustainable product, for energy efficient products, that progresses at its own pace, regardless of political shifts. And I would say that it changes a lot faster also. Like market demand can shift very quickly. And as a manufacturer, you have to adapt, whereas legislative changes, they can be slow. It's true that, let's say, once you have a requirement that's legally binding, then you don't have a choice. You have to follow it. But it's slow. It's usually not very ambitious. Like we see in the market, we see much more ambitious demands for sustainability, for instance, than we see what's regulated at this point. So a lot of this is driven by market considerations. Rather than by legislation, especially like for energy efficiency, for instance, there will always be a demand for energy efficient products because energy efficiency, there's a business case behind it, right? Which is that if you are willing to put the upfront investment, you get a return on investment because your energy bill is lower. And that has, there's of course a sustainability component to it, because if you lower your energy bill, you lower your energy consumption, you also lower the environmental impacts associated with energy. But for a lot of people, it's just, it's just the energy bill. It's just a cost concern, and there's always going to be a demand for that.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, and we might touch on it a little bit later as well, is that we're having a much more grown-up conversation about energy efficiency now than we were a decade ago. Primarily a decade ago, the focus was really on primary energy of technology, and a lot of focus on reducing how much a fan used in power and so on and so forth. And there are unintended consequences of that, as there are in almost anything if your focus is very one-dimensional. But I think what we've seen as the conversation has grown up a little bit about what sustainability and energy efficiency really is all about, a lot more things have been taken into consideration in the round. So we're seeing products that are being developed that take much more account of things like their reusability and recyclability, their robustness, their use of embodied carbon, how flexible they are to changes in demand, all of these things that actually matter to customers. I think that conversation has really grown up, hasn't it, over the last 10 years? You must have seen that, like, objectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in the energy performance of buildings, actually. I mean, we still call it the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. But if you read Article 1, the subject matter of the EPBD, it's about all kinds of things, right? It's about making buildings solar ready, about making sure to put charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. It's about indoor air quality as well. And so actually, it's not just an Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's a sustainable buildings directive. And sustainable in a holistic sense, right? Not just environmental impacts, but also the well-being of the building occupants, right? And how buildings fit in the wider built environment, and the role that they play, for example, for sustainable mobility. All of that is integrated, and you need to think about that holistically, right? Even if you're focusing only on environmental sustainability, energy is very important for HVAC equipment. Most of the environmental impacts come from energy consumption in use. But there are other impacts that this equipment has as well. For example, the embodied impacts of the materials that are in the product, or how it's treated at end of life, and the impacts that are associated with that. And for equipment that uses refrigerants also, obviously, if there is a leak of refrigerant, that can also impact the environment. So I think it's important to think about sustainability in a more holistic way. And I think that's also being done in the market and by the regulators. We see that there's more awareness of this. And to think of sustainability also in terms of, let's say, to put the people back at the center of the conversation, right? We build buildings for a reason, right? It's to create shelter for people and to create comfortable and healthy indoor environments. And I think it's good that we see sort of a shift in perspective, that buildings don't just consume energy. They're not just black boxes that consume energy, but we are consuming energy for a reason. And in fact, this goes to the very definition in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. There's a definition of what a building is. You think that's super basic, but it's really important, because it says a building is a construction with walls and a roof in which energy is used to condition the indoor environment. Okay, so you create, in the very definition of a building, you create a link between, we consume energy, but we do that for a reason, which is to condition the indoor environment. And if you're talking about energy performance or energy efficiency in a building, it's not just how much energy is consumed, but how much energy is consumed per unit value or per unit function, where the value for an HVAC system is the conditioning of the indoor environment. And I think for the first time in the history of the EPBD, that link has been made explicit. So that an energy performant building is a building that produces a healthy and comfortable indoor environment with the minimal energy possible, rather than just a building that doesn't consume any energy, because then we can all go back to live in caves, and we don't spend any energy and it's super sustainable, but obviously we lose something in that process.
Yeah. Do you think that explicit statements like that are important, that you can't rely on the assumption that ventilation isn't just there as an energy consumer, that it does actually have a purpose to provide an adequate indoor environment for people to occupy that space, whatever it is, that somehow you need to explicitly say that in order for it to have meaning down the line when it comes to standards?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, it's one of the biggest changes, I would say, in the EPBD is just the symbolic victory of the recognition that energy and indoor environmental quality are related to each other, right? That you can't just look at energy. And it's especially when you are focused on policy and you're making policy instruments, you're making legislation, all of which is designed to reduce energy, you can have this sort of monomaniacal focus on do whatever it takes to reduce energy, and you lose track of the fact that people are using energy for a reason, right? Energy is prosperity. Energy gives us quality of life, and of course there are environmental impacts associated with energy, and we want to minimize those. But I think it's too easy to just focus on reducing energy use to a minimum without thinking about what value that energy is providing to people.
And that characterization of, really for the first time in EPBD, what indoor environmental quality is. I mean, its job isn't to actually provide the thresholds and the standards specifically for it, but it's to note its level of importance, its hierarchy in the conversation, I suppose. But we now see that as not so much a Trojan horse, but we see that now as a mechanism for the standards that sit behind things like the energy performance of building directives, going, right, okay, so how do we describe this indoor environmental quality then? We need to start building the framework. And this is what often happens with the EPBD, isn't it? You get this big document comes, a bit like the EU taxonomy was very similar to that. It's like a big overarching document. Nobody really can figure out how you get from here to whatever it turns into. But what you find then is standards start populating the gap between and providing that bridge then between the big overarching document and the implementation of actual regulations in a country. And we've seen that, haven't we, with EN standards now really starting to create a framework about, okay, well, you say indoor environmental quality is important. What do we mean? How do we frame that? So we've seen the EN 13141-1, I think, isn't it? The where you start to see categories now of indoor environmental quality. So people can say, right, okay, do we want to build category 3 air quality homes in our country or something? And all of a sudden numbers start popping up.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that the EPBD is a directive, which means it's just relatively high level. It sets some overall goals, but it has to be implemented. First of all, it has to be transposed into national law. And then obviously that's only the beginning of it, right? Writing something into law doesn't make it so, right? There's a lot of other pieces that have to fall into place, like the standards. But also, we have to deliver energy efficient equipment, and we have to have good design, HVAC system design, and we have to have competent installers to install the equipment and to maintain it well, right? There's a whole lot of things that have to fall into place to actually make the difference. But I think it starts at the highest level. It starts with EPBD, just with the political recognition that this matters. And then there's a few things that are specified in the EPBD that I hope will trigger action on the ground, right? One is the fact that, the EPBD itself doesn't set requirements for indoor environmental quality, but it requires the member states to define IEQ standards, minimum requirements that buildings have to meet, let's say at the design stage, but also during operation. And some countries may already have such a standard. but it will not become mandatory for all member states to introduce standards like this. And the Commission also, they developed some guidance for what that might look like. The guidance is not binding, but they are referring to EN standards, specifically to EN 16798-1. And they're saying a reasonable minimum an indoor environmental quality level would be category 2, according to that standards, right? So they did flesh it out a little bit more to say to the member states, hey, there are some references, there are some standards already, and you need to implement those into national law. And I think there's also a couple of other aspects that are maybe less well known in the EPBD that I'm maybe even more hopeful about with regards to indoor environmental quality. And that is, one is monitoring and control requirements. So new buildings, non-residential buildings, are required to install IEQ monitoring and control devices. And you might ask, what does that mean? And in the guidance documents, again, non-binding guidance documents, the Commission clarifies that at the very least, this means monitoring CO2 in buildings. And it also says, where relevant, to monitor, for example, PM 2.5 concentration in the buildings. And I'm very hopeful about that because I think it helps to make, as I like to say, the invisible visible, right? That you don't, as a building occupant, a naive building occupant, you don't really know about indoor air quality. It's not something that you have the senses for, except maybe the sense of smell. But even there, I think that there's plenty of indoor pollutants that don't have a smell associated with them. And to just have something, on the wall that says, this air is kind of stale, right? And the indoor environment is not conducive to your health and well-being. I think that can trigger meaningful change. And I'm very enthusiastic about that. And the other one also is about enforcing the requirements when the building is in operation, right? So that we're not just designing something on paper, but also that over the course of the building, we continue to monitor if the indoor environmental quality is met. And there are requirements in the EPBD, for example, that you have to do regular inspections of your HVAC system. And that includes checking if the ventilation rates are still adequate for the use of the building. And also you have to, when you do the energy performance certificate of the building, the EPC auditor also has to check that the indoor environmental quality is adequate, and he has to make recommendations to the building owner if it's not adequate, what improvements he should consider, right? And that means that over the course of the building, there are sort of these milestones where the building owner is reminded of the condition of his building and the impacts that might have on building occupants, so that it's not just, okay, I designed the system and then I forget about it, but you're held accountable.
Yeah, I really like that, and it kind of reflects at a high level the structure of a lot of the strategy work I do with organisations around ventilation and air quality, right? Because what you're often saying to people at a strategic level, at a building level, is first of all, you need to define as an organisation what good looks like, right? And that's what the EPBD says. This is important. The EN standards start to define what good could look like. So you have a starting place, or you have a goal. Ultimately, it's very difficult to have a direction of travel if you don't know what you're aiming for, right? So that definition is really important. But you can't manage what you don't measure equally. So particularly when it comes to ventilation. So this introduction of mandatory testing of or monitoring of buildings is really important. It makes the visible, as you say, the invisible visible. But then you also need to check you've got what you paid for operationally. And this is where we see this time and time again in the building stock, that, there was design intent behind ventilation, but nobody's ever checked in the 5 years since that it's that meeting room A in the corner there is still getting the ventilation that it was supposed to. And nobody realised that it was a partition that was added 3 years ago and it doesn't actually have any ventilation in it at all. It missed that particular part of the HVAC system when it was installed. Things like that are so incredibly important in the real world. So, like, if you were developing a strategy, that approach of saying, right, what does good look like? How do you actually measure what you've got, and how do we check that we continue to get it over time? And check what you're getting, what you're paying for. It's a really important, substantive kind of strategic approach, actually. And a lot of hope. Let's hope that happens. I mean, I know, speaking to some colleagues, Valerie Le Prince from Cerema, I always laugh when I think back to this. She was saying, I was asking her about what her perspective of testing ventilation systems was at a European level. And they said they'd done quite a bit of research in France looking at what the potential was to actually measure existing ventilation systems. And largely it was impossible, because a lot of ventilation systems had frankly never been installed to be measured on an ongoing basis. Like that, practically actually going into every building and trying to measure what they're doing is really hard. So having a standard that sets that out as a desire from day one, say, well, look, your system will need access to be able to measure this down the line, and will be incredibly important. But in lieu of that, we can monitor spaces. If you can't measure the aerolic performance of a ventilation system, you can measure its outcomes from an air quality perspective. So you can kind of catch it. And we saw that actually manifest in the Code of Practice for Indoor Air Quality in Ireland. The Health and Safety Authority here was tasked with developing a code of practice that came under health and safety, and largely it came to the same conclusion, which I always think is really interesting when different organizations in different countries do things for different reasons and you largely come to the same conclusion. There's probably some logic there behind it. And that was the thing that they came up with, was that, look, you've got two choices if you want to do a ventilation risk assessment on a building. You either every couple of years measure the performance of the ventilation system and have a process of having that documented and checked, like you would do your air conditioning systems and your gas boilers and so on. And if you can't do that, then you need to monitor those spaces so that you can check that you're getting the outcomes that you require. So there's probably a deep logic in there somewhere that most countries are going to probably end up in the same boat, to say, look, our existing stock, it's going to be hard for us to actually have an engineer go around once a year and actually measure the flow rates, because it's all buried up behind ceiling tiles, and there was never any pressure nipples installed, and like the cost of actually getting it into a position where we can check it is going to be prohibitive. Or I can chuck an indoor air quality monitor on the wall. And if I'm getting bad results, I can turn it up a bit, and if I can't turn it up a bit.
I think it's going to have to change, because, the EPBD makes it mandatory to inspect ventilation systems, right? Not just heating and cooling systems, but also ventilation systems. And it's, again, to make the link between energy efficiency and indoor air quality. It's not just to check that the indoor air quality is fine and that the ventilation rates that are needed are being delivered, but obviously it has an impact on the energy efficiency of the building if your ventilation system is not working the way it should. And I think the country that is maybe the most advanced on this, according to my impressions, in Sweden. In Sweden, they have a mandatory ventilation inspection, which has to be done every X years. I don't remember now the interval. But they did some research and they found that it's one of the most common triggers for an energy efficiency renovation is when the building fails its ventilation inspection, right? So actually checking that the ventilation system works the way it's supposed to. And when you find that it doesn't, that's one of the most common triggers for improving the energy efficiency of the building, right? So again, there's this link between indoor air quality and energy efficiency. I think often people frame it as though there's a trade-off between the two. And of course, let's say conceptually there is. Let's say if you want to increase the airflow or whatever, that's going to cost you more energy, or you want a higher filtration efficiency, that's going to cost you more energy. But I think in reality, given the fact that most of our buildings are already there, we're not talking about a hypothetical system. We're talking about an old building with an old ventilation system. In reality, you can improve both at the same time. You can improve indoor air quality and energy efficiency with the same set of renovation measures. And I think that's also the perspective shift that we need to encourage.
Yeah, and I know there's some academic work has been done on that, and they've shown that in a lot of typical buildings, improving ventilation rates, which inevitably means better operation and efficient running of the existing system or replacement of elements of it, actually doesn't lead to higher energy costs. It leads to lower energy costs because by concentrating on the ventilation, you find those efficiencies within the ventilation. The additional ventilation heat loss or the additional primary energy use is often, discounted against things like more efficient motors and other stuff that ends up going in. So that it's not as it's not as clear cut. So that's really fascinating that's the trigger. I think what I'm seeing already at a national level, and I find this fascinating, is something that the ventilation and air quality community has been advocating for a long time. And that is that all of a sudden, when you put the environment in the driving seat, yes, you have to consider energy, but it's now a joined up conversation for the first time. And you realize that actually, and I've seen this at a regulation level in Ireland, it's like going, well, hang on a minute, what happens if a developer decides that he wants to deliver category 1 homes from an air quality perspective? That's completely at his. There's nothing in our regulations that say I can't ventilate twice as much as the minimum standards say. That might be a good thing. That might be a market differentiator for a particular developer to develop category 1 air quality homes. They might see that as a market advantage. The challenge is that the national governments don't have any way of accounting for that in their standards currently, because most of them have always assumed minimum flow rates in their energy calculations. They've never had to look down from the other side of the telescope, as we say. Well, what happens if somebody doesn't want the minimum? They actually want better or best practice from an air quality perspective. What if somebody wants 800 parts per million of CO2 as a threshold limit for their bedroom? Can we stop them? No, arguably that's a good thing. So we've actually got to start accounting for that. It's a bit like the circularity conversation. You end up having these much more grown-up conversations about what the purpose of a building actually is. And we've seen this for years and years from a ventilation community perspective, that products roll in with an energy focus and disrupt air quality outcomes because they're not thinking about the outcomes, the unintended consequences of whatever they're doing to optimize energy. And that's because air quality wasn't in the driving seat. But now, as the EPBD comes in and indoor environmental quality is a focus, you've got to have that conversation. And I've already spoken to a couple of developers about this, saying, if I was you, I'd start to be thinking about, it's very hard for a developer now to differentiate in the marketplace from an energy perspective. We're all building, if you know how to build a modern airtight home, everybody's building a pretty energy efficient space. We've seen that with the closing of the gap between passive house standards and minimum standards, that the erosion of a differentiator there. Look, most modern homes, if built to code, are pretty energy efficient by and large. So that differentiator's gone. As a developer in the marketplace, what are you left with? Well, what's really important to people? Thermal comfort, acoustics, lighting, air quality. What are the things that people actually buy when they buy a new home? All of a sudden, that stuff starts to become more important and a potential differentiator. So you have to start accounting for that now as a developer. Do I start to build grade A air quality homes for people?
One reflection that triggers for me is also the fact that just because you design a system in one way doesn't mean, like, you can't predict how the occupant is going to respond, right? So if you are not delivering a comfortable indoor space for someone, how are they going to respond to that, right? They have some agency in that, and they might decide, okay, it's really stuffy here, I'm going to open the window. And then it gets too cold for the person sitting next to you, and so they will put a little local space heater next to themselves, right? And you design your system to be super energy efficient, but you're ending up wasting an enormous amount of energy because people are not comfortable in that environment, right? And they are adapting in ways that are not considered in the energy performance calculation, because it has nothing to do with the system design. I think we're not thinking enough about that.
No, true. And that's what I think is interesting about these it becomes much more complex when we start thinking about our environment instead of in silos in a joined up way. Because lots of things have unintended consequences, both positive and negative. And the energy air quality one is very simple. But you start looking at the energy, air quality, and acoustics combination, and that's even more complicated. The multiplier effect of the potential outcomes just keeps going up. And I think that's a bridge we really haven't crossed in the built environment, where you actually have to start thinking in terms of outcomes. You then have to start answering questions that are much more complex than you might have had to previously. I mean, we've seen the start of this, right, with things like exhaust air heat pumps and ventilation systems that include the heating system as part of them. Thinking of NIBE and NILAN type ventilation systems that are much more complex than just a heat recovery system. That there's a complexity and a nuance to getting those right. And we've failed objectively to do that well in the past. There's been some pretty catastrophic systems have been installed into developments over the years that haven't got that right, and somebody's either paid a ventilation or an energy penalty as a result, right? But we're still making some of those mistakes. You're still seeing products going into properties that where an exhaust air heat pump will focus on the efficiency of the heat pump part of it in detriment to the ventilation and comfort side of things. So this is what's really interesting is that we're moving into this space where we have to start thinking much more holistically about buildings, making intelligent trade-offs and having to have those conversations with users of those spaces that are, it's going to be an interesting time, I think. And as technology keeps evolving, and you see that in Eurovent, I'm sure, is that this technology is getting smarter. We're seeing demand controlled elements, automation. We're seeing the combination of heat pumps and ventilation systems and thermal stores. And, it's not just a boiler on a wall and a fan in a roof and a hole in a wall. And, these things have to talk and work together now.
There's massive potential there for, let's call it system integration with smart controls, where you try to optimize the whole system, and you can produce domestic hot water, and you can provide air conditioning, and you can provide ventilation all in one package. And it's measuring the outdoor conditions, and it's measuring the indoor conditions, and it's optimizing everything. And there are huge energy savings that are available there. But I think this is a solution mostly for new buildings. And I think it's a lot more difficult to retrofit an old building to install a solution like that, because the original building was not designed in that way. And I think that's the challenge also, is what's the technology solution for those, 35 million buildings that we have to renovate, right? I mean, it's not an easy thing.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing about the European context, is very much it tends to look through the lens of the existing stock, because that's the challenge of Europe, is the existing buildings, right? I can't remember what the stat is, but 90% of the buildings that exist today will still be standing in 2050 or whatever the stat is. That's our challenge here. Whereas if you're in India or the Middle East or China, the square footprint of those countries is going to double by 2060. So it's a new build problem largely, right? So it's a different. So often our lens in Europe is what the hell do we do with the vast array of building typologies that we have? And interestingly, a lot of them are what we would class as traditional buildings in Europe. In different countries that threshold is a different year, but quite a large percentage of the stock of Europe would be classed as traditional building, which requires an extra layer of skills and knowledge to manage properly. There are nuances to solid wall, sandstone, granite buildings with, that are ventilated very differently. There's a real nuance to those that we haven't got our head around properly yet either. We think we've got labour shortages for engineers when it comes to new builds and stuff. You wait till you look down the barrel of what the hell do you do with the existing stock and the old buildings, because that skill set is dying as those people retire. That and the That's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think also the focus tends to be a lot on Western Europe, and the way that we've built buildings in Western Europe, but the way that they built in Central and Eastern Europe is completely different, right? I mean, before the Iron Curtain fell, these were communist countries, and they had a completely different approach of building buildings for people. And I don't think that the same solution that's going to work in the UK is going to work, in the Czech Republic, for instance, because we build in very different ways. And that's also, I think, why at the end of the day, the EPBD is a directive, because you can't go into the specifics, because the specifics are hyper local, right? The way that you build in one country, or even in one town or
One
in
region.
one municipality,
Yeah,
is completely
totally.
different.
Yeah. I was chatting to a lady when I was over in India there a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago now at this stage. And she's an architect and looks at sustainable transitions in Nepal. And in Nepal, there's such a change in elevation as you go up into the mountains, that building archetypes are changing almost completely out of recognition every 20 miles. Because they've been built over the centuries to survive and flourish in that particular type of environmental space. So one rule for one part of Nepal is going to be completely different to the rule that would work even 100 miles away. It's crazy, but it's no different in Europe. Particularly moving from mountain regions to plateau areas, from Northern Europe to the Mediterranean. Like, the differences in construction typology are just profound.
Yeah, and we often forget that we have some countries that are cooling dominated climates, like in Malta and Cyprus. We have a tendency to just forget about that, but the challenge there looks completely different.
I'll get you back to the podcast in just a moment. I'd just like to take a minute to tell you about Zehnder, one of our partners. Zehnder is one of those companies that, if you're working in indoor air, you've probably come across. They really cover the full spectrum when it comes to ventilation, from simple mechanical extract right through to full climate systems where fresh air is enriched with heating and cooling. They offer the ventilation units, and they also offer everything around it: air distribution components, smart controls, the expert advice to make sure systems actually work as designed. One of the things I really like about Zehnder is their focus on knowledge through their experience centres and the Zehnder Academy. They help professionals keep pace with this fast-changing world of indoor climate. Whether it's tackling overheating, improving indoor air in tight retrofits, or simply making sure your filters are doing their job, Zehnder brings experience, depth of knowledge, and clarity to the conversation around healthy buildings. So if you're involved in building design, housing, or indoor environmental quality, they're really worth checking out. Details are in the links in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, of course, and at Zehnder, that's ZEHNDER group.com. Now, back to the podcast. As I'm talking to you this week, the episode that came out this week was with a guy called Chandra Sarkar, and he's very well known for energy and ventilation and air quality in Singapore in hot and humid climates. And one of the questions I was asking him was, as this part of the world, and by I mean this, Europe in general, is starting to have to think about active cooling in buildings for the first time, are there lessons that can be learnt from regions like Singapore that deal with heat and moisture? I'm not saying that we'll ever be tropics, but are there lessons about the transition into active cooling of spaces, and how, where that divide sits between managing buildings passively with outdoor air and air conditioning systems? Can we learn some lessons? And he was saying, yeah, absolutely. We've gone through a lot of hard lessons in certain parts of the world about what works and what doesn't. And interestingly, one of the things that he was saying was that they've found great success in separating conditioning of spaces from ventilation of spaces for air quality perspective. That they found that by siloing the two, you can concentrate on getting the right outcomes. And sometimes where the two have been joined up, not that it can't be done, but to do it well is so complex that they found, by saying, actually, no, you need to deliver air quality with ventilation. You condition spaces with air conditioning, and keep them separate so that it's simple enough for people to understand and have some agency in controlling themselves. Because I think that's one of the challenges we're going to have as we tie these systems together more and more. It's a bit like I'm of a generation that have gone from having to fix car engines to having to send engines into the mechanic because, it isn't points and gaps and distributors and things anymore. It's computer systems and chips and so on. The car is too complex for a layperson, largely, other than basic maintenance, to understand. And buildings perhaps will move in that direction as we join up these systems, and you have to control them, and they're automated, and it's thinking about grid reactivity, thermal storage, thermal comfort, energy use, and making decisions in the background. What's a homeowner or even the local plumber going to be able to do to determine why you're seeing an outcome that you're seeing, unless he can plug a computer in it and read the diagnostics? That could be where we're heading with buildings.
It's a change in skill sets also for installers and people who do maintenance, that it's not good enough anymore to be just a plumber or something like this, right? You have to understand the digital world as well and how these systems are controlled. But I think it's unavoidable because there are such huge benefits to this, to the smart control of systems and responding to the grid and responding to user demand. And this is the way forward, without any doubt.
I agree completely, and I use the analogy of cars all the time. And we've done that successfully with an asset that's arguably much less than the asset of our homes and our buildings. So if we can do it with something that's of that value, I'm sure we can do it with buildings. And I use this. It's about the user experience and user interface. As a friend of mine says, everything is user experience. When we drive a car, the information that we're shown to make the right decisions is quite simple, in the same way that the information you might present to a homeowner might be quite simple. I'm driving along and the red oil light comes on the dashboard. Now, behind that, there might be an awful lot of sophistication on looking at oil viscosity, oil levels, pump service and maintenance. There could be all sorts of things turning that red simple interface on. All I know is I need to go and stop and maybe check the oil level and perhaps speak to the mechanic, right? That's about as far as I'm going to go down that rabbit hole, because that light comes on. When I give it to my mechanic is going to plug a computer in, and he will see which sensors are faulty, whether or not, he can make some determination whether it's just an oil change that's needed or whether there's something else going on that needs fixing. In the same way that, like you say, a plumber or a maintenance person comes into a building, may well plug something into one of these systems and get a good read as to why meeting room 2 is flashing red this week, right? And start to understand that, or why a home is not comfortable, but the system seems to be working. They would get a read, and it would help them do their job better. Your expectation when you send your car in, it almost of any age now, is that somebody's going to plug a computer into it at some point and see what's going on, right? But then at a manufacturing level, just to finish my kind of pulling the story together, from a manufacturing level, every time you take your car in and that computer's plugged in, that data goes back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer then starts to learn which of the fuel pumps in its supply chain fails early. It starts to understand how its cars are driven and used and deteriorate over time, and it helps them improve their product over time by iteration. You can very much see the built environment moving in that direction, that actually this data that now gets collected by people feeds all the way back to the beginning of the supply chain, that it enables developers or manufacturers of products to go, well, hang on a minute, I'm seeing this brand of ventilation fan failing at year 5 over and over and over again. Maybe we need to check our supply chain and see why that is. That data's siloed at the moment. You don't generally see it. So I think the potential, there's a lot of analogies between the two industries, actually, automobile and the built environment, that you can see the trajectory, that you could get to this period of time where There's very simple interfaces on walls for homeowners and users of buildings. There's good data for the people managing those buildings, and there's data feeding back all the way to the beginning of the supply chain that helps people build a better product by iteration. Because one of the things the construction sector has been very poor at is feedback loops, is post-occupancy data to help them improve their products. We've improved construction through generations rather than in years because of data feedback loops. And that is going to change construction out of all recognition. It can only be a good thing, I think.
Yeah, and in fact, this is changing very rapidly because of AI, what they call AI, let's say, of large language models and these kind of things, these neural networks that can learn from huge amounts of data, and that can also radically simplify the way you interact with the system, right? Where you're not writing code anymore or anything like this, but you can just chat into sort of a chat box, and the system can sort of interpret human language, natural language, and send feedback to the system and retrieve some data, or say, this is what your energy consumption over the last month was, or we are predicting some fault or failure in this system based on the way that it's been acting in the previous months. And there's a lot of innovation happening there, and I think that's gonna make it. In some ways, it makes it even more complex, but I think it also makes it a lot more accessible, right? It's not just about a little red light that comes on, but you can actually talk to the system in some way. And we are only at the beginning of that, and I think we're going to see a lot more.
What's your sense of the public awareness of indoor environmental quality? We've talked about the legislative and the EPBD kind of recognition of indoor environmental quality. Certainly within the construction supply chains, there's a recognition of the importance of ventilation now as a critical pillar, I think, in the performance of a building. But there's still a gap, I think, from there to purchasing decisions, ultimately, both at a non-residential and a residential level, in investing in the right infrastructure. Is that a correct read, do you think, of where we are, that the industry and the regulations are primed for this in some ways, but somehow we need to see this being taken up at a consumer level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think COVID made a big difference for the awareness. I think a lot of people became aware of the importance of the air that you breathe and the fact that there might be sort of invisible pollutants in the air that can harm your health. I think that really hit home during COVID. And I think there was a lot more awareness about the importance of ventilation, of air exchange, to dilute pollutant concentrations. And so I think without a doubt, there's a kind of awareness about indoor air quality that didn't exist before. But there are two concerns that I have about that. One is that awareness will just fade because we've sort of moved on from COVID, even though it's still around. We've kind of moved on for it, and we want to forget about it. And I'm afraid that as it recedes from view, so will the awareness about indoor air quality recede. And the other thing is that we did not see any shift in sort of the technology trends or the market trends that resulted from this increased awareness. So you might think that there might be, we might see more demand for mechanical ventilation systems in schools, for instance, where there was a lot of focus on schools as a hotspot for COVID. But we didn't see that, in fact. Or you might think that people put higher filtration efficiency filters in their HVAC systems, but we also didn't see that. So although there is a lot more awareness, we didn't actually see that translate into changes in consumer behavior. And I think part of it has to do, let's say, once you've raised awareness about the importance of indoor air quality, there's still a lot of other things that have to fall into place, right? The first is you have to know what to do about it. So if I find out that the indoor air quality in my school, for instance, is inadequate, that doesn't mean that I know how to fix it, right? You need expertise for that. You need guidance for that. And maybe there was not enough guidance available for people, because when you hear stories of where in certain countries they would install CO2 meters, for instance, in classrooms, and the teachers would see that the CO2 is rising in the classroom, but they have no idea what to do about it, right? And the only thing that's available to them is to open the window or whatever it might be, but then it gets too cold in the classroom, or there's noise outside, and they close the windows again, right? So you need structural solutions, right? You need engineers to design ventilation systems in a way that can solve this problem without the teacher in front of the classroom having to fix it. And I think that's maybe the missing link. And the other thing also is that indoor air quality is not just about the way the system is designed, but it's also the way the system is operated and the way the system is installed and the way the system is maintained over its lifetime. And all of these things have to fall into place if you want to see real change. And I think we still have a lot of homework to do in that respect.
I think it's really interesting, and actually it's probably a really powerful reflection speaking to an organization like Eurovent about, did we objectively see an impact on products and the deployment of technology as a result of something like the pandemic, and the feeling is backed up by the reality that no, there was a lot of talk, but what we didn't see was a massive take up in retrofitting of HVAC systems into classrooms, which you'd have at one point you'd have thought, well, that will be the next 10 years for the ventilation industry is upgrading ventilation systems in classrooms. Or we've seen in certain public housing sectors a recognition that damp and mold is causing major issues with health, and you'd expect now that the next decade will be upgrading those homes with decent ventilation systems to help limit that. But then you see the same old technology being replaced with the same old technology year in, year out, and wondering why nothing's changing. So it's interesting. You kind of reflect that as an industry organization, your members are going, well, we didn't see, like you say, there was no pickup in UV, there was no pickup in filters, there was no pickup in school ventilation. There was marginally in some countries maybe more interest than others, but overall that blip in interest and awareness didn't translate into a long tail of deployment, which is what you'd hoped.
I mean, one thing that we did see is a lot of interest in air purifiers.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of people think that to solve indoor air quality, all you need to do is to buy an air purifier. And you see, like household appliance brands going into this area, like big brands. I don't have to mention them that make these sort of air purifiers for home, and you can buy them in IKEA even, but again, this is like putting a band-aid on an open wound, right? Of course, there's a role for air purifiers to complement ventilation, but air purifiers alone are not going to give you the indoor air quality that you need, right? And so again, here, there's a lot of work that still has to be done about creating standards and making sure that the technologies we deploy are verified and you can trust it, and also to check the outcomes, right? We go back to the monitoring CO2, monitoring particulate matter indoors, and so on and so forth, to check that the solution that you have installed is actually delivering what you expect it to do.
I think, in fairness, one of the challenges we had with such a shock during the pandemic was a lack of readiness of knowing what to do. And I think we're in a much better place now than we were 5 years ago, in the sense that we've got standards like ASHRAE 241, organizations like REVA and SIBSI and others have produced very good guidance and documents about pandemic preparedness, about how to have a building working in a way that operates successfully in those types of environments. That there's case studies now that are available where people can roadmap what this might look like for their space. We've seen that, and those standards be applied, and we've seen academic research look at the impacts of some of that work and shown that it basically evidenced the efficacy of those types of interventions. So I think if it were to happen again, which many say it will, of course, that in theory, if we retain that knowledge and those lessons, in theory, we can trigger that. But I think one of the things that has stopped a lot of sectors actually going, right, okay, then let's sort this out. And this is what Kath Noakes said about her work in SAGE at the time, was that actually what the pandemic asked of us was, do we have any clue about the ventilation performance in our buildings? And the answer was no. We have no idea actually how our schools are ventilating, how our offices are ventilating. Actually, we're completely blind. And I think one of the fears that's come out of this is that when we did go in and look, we realized what a lot of us have been saying for a long time, is that actually our existing buildings are ventilating very badly in a lot of cases. And the fear, I think, for educational institutions or offices and landlords and so on, is that this is a big cost, actually, to get this building to where it needs to be. So I think there's a bit of fear there often that, what's a national government going to do about 75% of its schools that are naturally ventilated and frankly just not prepared to provide healthy air for their students? Can they afford to put an MVHR system into every classroom? On paper, no. They're looking at this and saying, well, I'd rather not look at this, to be honest, because it's scary. So a lot of this is, I think, a lot of the lack of action has been out of fear and being frozen by the scale of the challenge. And we see this in housing as well. Every time we look at it, 75% of homes are probably underventilated significantly in some way or other. That means if you're a landlord of 50,000 properties of public housing and you've got to square away this idea that 25,000 of your homes or more probably need an upgrade in the ventilation system, that's probably a subject, if you're not forced to look at it, you'd rather not go down because you don't have the budgets for that.
It's obviously more complicated than that, because there are cost reductions also from improving indoor environmental quality. If you do a renovation of your building, you save on the energy costs, obviously. But on top of that, there's also a return on investment on indoor air quality. And we know that, right? The science show that. And if you could somehow add that all up and you could just make a rational decision about, okay, here, this is what my upfront costs are going to be. This is how much costs I'm going to save. And there are cost savings sort of privately at the building level, but also at the social level, in terms of reduced healthcare costs and improved productivity and these kind of things. And then you can just make it a rational decision. Of course, there's still the challenge. Where's the upfront money going to come from? There has to be some financing mechanism, but that's a problem that we can fix. This is what markets are for. We can come up with financing solutions for that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's one of those, the sustainability has gone through the same, kind of bring it full circle back to the EPBD, that sustainability has gone through that same journey. Like, how do we retrofit and renovate our building stock? Well, we understand that the able to pays have probably already spent that money, and the governments can only support this through grants for so long. We need other financial mechanisms in place, banks, pension schemes, green loans, all of these different mechanisms to support that sector and enable that transition. Probably something similar in indoor environmental quality. You need to start factoring in the ROI and economic benefit of healthier buildings so that you can introduce these financial mechanisms that can support that kind of a transition. And we're seeing the seeds of that. There's companies popping up in India that do air quality as a service, so kind of ESCO type models for improvements in ventilation at scale. Organizations like public housing are starting to factor in the ROI of better ventilation in things like less maintenance, less damp and mold, less loss of rent because of decamping tenants, all these things that cost them money that are affected by bad outcomes. If you fix that, it's not just the cost of a fan, you're saving money on all the downstream negative impacts of a poor environment. So we'll see that happen hopefully over time.
Yeah, and to be honest, I also have a concern about this, because this focus on affordability, especially in housing, for instance, there's now a lot of focus on affordable housing. But if again, the focus is only on affordability and you don't think more holistically about, a sustainable building that's going to it's going to stand there for maybe 100 years, maybe less. What are the things that go into that? And it's not just sort of cutting corners in order to make it as affordable as possible, right? It has to be energy efficient. It has to be healthy. You have to make sure that you don't get these problems with mold in the building. And you have to think a little bit more long-term. And I think this short-term perspective on affordability, to the exclusion of other things like indoor air quality, I think it's very short-sighted, and I think it's going to backfire. I think an affordable building must integrate these sort of energy efficiency and healthy indoor environments aspects. And we see that today, that quite often the buildings that perform the worst on indoor environmental quality, indoor air quality, that have problems with mold, are quite often the buildings that were designed to be affordable. And now it turns out that they're causing problems.
Yeah.
So because they didn't have the foresight.
Yeah.
And I hope we don't repeat that mistake, that if we're going to make affordable housing today, that we think about the fact that in 50 years, I hope we're not stuck with this huge building stock, which is full of mold and and people are suffering the consequences of that.
I think that's what's interesting about the real estate sector and private finance is that it's been operating under a kind of structure of ESG and the EU taxonomy and the EU social taxonomy and stuff for a while now. It's starting to think in terms of what's the value and risk of assets over time. And they take a much more balanced and long-term risk view on this stuff. So they've got no interest in being financially tied to an asset that, while it might be energy efficient from a primary energy use perspective, is going to have really big negative impacts on community and health and well-being over time that would devalue that asset ultimately. So I think that's the interesting thing when you kind of talk to people from the likes of GRESB and Well and people that are involved in financing real estate, that are increasingly being pulled into the renovation of assets, even as far down as residential settings, that they're thinking much more holistically about this now because they're long-term risk finance people. You know, they it's amazing how money makes the world go round, and these organizations are very unsentimental. They've got zero interest in a building that is unleasable or rentable or sellable in 20 years' time because it carries with it a big mold risk or a big health impact, or the community deteriorates because they didn't think through transport and access to rail and things like that when it was being conceived. You know, like that's just the way they work. It's really interesting to see that. And you talk to them and they get it. And the developers, when you speak to people that are involved in building these buildings or renovating them at scale, they'll say to you, look, we're being asked very tough questions by the people that are financing this stuff now. It's not just, you know, a vanilla sustainability brochure doesn't cut it anymore. They want the hard numbers. They want to know this building is healthy and how we're going to demonstrate that. Because if we can't, that's a risk for them they're carrying long term.
I mean, part of me thinks it's a shame that we have to talk always about sort of the monetized value of everything, and that's the only way to get things to change. But I think it is in fact the way to, let's say, if you want people to make rational decisions, then you have to present these kind of very dry facts. You provide sort of the monetized perspective on health and well-being in buildings, that this is an asset and you want to preserve the asset. And I think if we find the ways to do that, you know, the schemes that create the confidence, like, you know, building certification scheme that says, yes, this building meets, you know, these criteria and it's an asset worth investing, then you can valorize it. And then you can count on people making rational decisions, you know, in their own self-interest that have positive effects in terms of, you know, the health outcomes and the well-being of the people, of the building occupants. It's a shame that it should work that way, that we are not motivated by sort of the intrinsic good of well-being and these kind of things. But maybe that's the optimistic.
I think most of us that live in the real world understand that at some point, the moment somebody's got to pay for anything, you've got to justify the spend in some way or other. I think what's interesting is that this comes from two ends of the spectrum. As these standards and as the availability of monitoring and the visibility of air quality and demographics change over time, the younger generation have much more value in the health of the building than perhaps our generation or previous would have done. It becomes more important to the ultimate purchaser and renter and consumer of those spaces, and they will drive it from the other end of the scale as well. You know, that value of that asset in 15, 20 years time is not just a on paper value. It's what somebody's prepared to pay for it. And if I'm a 20 something looking at starting a family, moving into a block of flats somewhere in a city in Europe, and one block of apartments has got a good air quality outcome that's visible, and there's a website where people can complain and compare air quality of buildings and so on, and another building doesn't, it might start affecting the rental costs or purchasing value of that building from the other end of the scale. And we see that as well. You know, in the studies, we know that healthy buildings have a market value above that of buildings that don't. So we're starting to see that on the ground. You know, people are prepared to pay more money for something that delivers better health. And that really gets the attention of the people investing in those buildings, you know, because ultimately, in a lot of cases, it comes down to investment in stock, and whether that's an individual or whether that's large banks, they're having to make decisions on where that money goes. And the more important health and well-being becomes, the more they'll expect to see investment in that stock in those areas.
To tie this back to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, I think this is something that we would have liked to see, and we didn't quite get it. But I think we're on the way there, is to create a sort of an analog for the energy performance certificate of the building, where you also see sort of other aspects of the performance of the buildings in that same document in a very simple way. Like the energy, you don't have to be, an engineer or to know anything about energy performance to see from the energy performance certificate that your building is it's green, it has an A or a B or something like this, and you can understand it in a very simple way. And if we could create something similar, some indicators in the documentation of the building that shows that this building has, a ventilation system that's designed to reach a certain indoor air quality levels, then you can also create the confidence, both, for the building occupant who decides to rent the space, the building owner, the people who are financing. And I think that's probably the way forward.
Well, Stijn, I knew it was going to be a meandering conversation around that big question, but I think hopefully for listeners, we've touched on a few interesting areas. I think for me, in kind of conclusion to that part of it, the foundational work has been done at a European level. There's some documents that set the stage. We're now in this phase to see what national countries do at a national level to implement that stage that's been set. And as an organisation, you're right at the coalface with your members, seeing that manifest over the next few years. So I think a good question for people that may not be aware of Eurovent, perhaps what's the elevator pitch of what Eurovent is? Because it's more than just a European representative organisation now. What do Eurovent do?
So Eurovent is an association that represents HVAC manufacturers. And a part of what we do is to monitor legislative developments like the EPBD that have an impact on our sector. We try to work on standards as well. And market education and awareness raising, for instance, on indoor environmental quality and the technologies that can deliver it. And also through an independent subunit that we have, we also do independent third-party performance certification for products. So that's the Eurovent Certified Performance mark. And every product that bears that mark, you can count on the fact that the performance of that product has been tested in a laboratory independently. The manufacturer's laboratory, the manufacturer's factory has been audited. Its selection software has been audited to create the kind of confidence that's needed that the technology that is provided by the manufacturer really delivers on what was promised. And as you say, it's not just European. I mean, we have a very strong manufacturing base in Europe, actually. There are more than 350 manufacturing sites in Europe for HVAC technologies. And European companies export these technologies to North Africa, to the Middle East, to India. And it's also a matter of promoting these principles of life cycle thinking, sustainability, and these kind of things, also in markets which tend to be more cost-driven and cost-oriented. So we have a chapter in the Middle East, and we have a chapter in India as well.
So what's the broad ecosystem then? When you say the HVAC industry, what are the kind of products or groups of systems that you have under your remit? Are you going as far as monitoring of buildings? Is it filters and filter materials? Is it fans? Is it air conditioner? What's the kind of is there an easy way to describe the kind of the boundary conditions of the family that kind of come under the Eurovent banner?
It's all of the above, Simon. So we represent manufacturers of heat pumps, air conditioners, chillers, variable refrigerant flow systems, air handling units, air filters, fan coil units, duct work. We also represent refrigeration manufacturers, so supermarket freezers and refrigerators and these kind of things. And you might think, what do these have to do with each other? But in fact, they are part of the same industrial ecosystem. It's the same kind of core competence. It's, mechanical engineering and thermodynamics and refrigerant circuits and moving air and heating and cooling. And in fact, a lot of companies provide solutions across the full range of, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning technologies. And in many cases, these systems are we discussed it a little bit earlier, they're integrated into a common system that provides domestic hot water, heating, cooling, ventilation, especially in large buildings and commercial buildings. Everything has to talk to each other. The chiller and the air handling unit and the ductwork and the fan coil units, everything has to talk to each other, and it has to be integrated. And let's say the building owner, he doesn't buy this piece of equipment and this piece of equipment and this piece of equipment. He wants a system that delivers everything that's needed.
That's interesting. And is there a kind of remit to the types of buildings that Eurovent is for? So your focus is on the industry itself. So you have to have expertise in pharmaceuticals, in medical settings, in residential, in real estate and office space, so that your members are dealing with the full spectrum of any space that needs heating, ventilation and air conditioning, and the stuff that wraps around that you have to have an awareness of.
Yeah, that's right. So if you think of a filter, it's deployed in buildings, let's say for buildings that are designed for human occupancy, but filters are used also in industry. If you are you are manufacturing semiconductors, you have to prevent dust and particles from settling onto the semiconductors. So they use air filters as well in industry, or air conditioning. It's not just air conditioning for the thermal comfort of human beings, but also air conditioning in data centers, for instance. Data centers require a lot of cooling, right? The servers generate heat, and it's a kind of building that has to be cooled. That has nothing to do with what we would think of as buildings designed for human occupancy. But the technology is the same, right? And in a lot of ways, it works in the same way. The demands are slightly different. The market dynamics are slightly different. But it is, it's chillers and air conditioners of the kind that you'd expect.
Yeah, building physics is building physics, regardless of the building. Exactly. Yeah. The laws of thermodynamics are the laws of thermodynamics. Yeah, I suppose exactly. There's that simplification at least. But that must mean you must have to have an enormously broad amount of awareness of all of these instruments, legislative instruments, regulatory instruments, the market dynamics in different regions. That's a huge undertaking. I'm guessing Eurovent certification is quite a big organization at this stage to be able to have a full understanding of each of these kind of verticals.
In fact, the association, we are, it's not that big. We're 6 or 7 people. The certification is much bigger because it requires a lot more involvement. But it's a small team that does this work, and really we rely on the expertise of our members, right? So we have a lot of working groups in which our members get together and they participate, and they have the expertise, right? And all that we do as an organization is to put them in the same room and to share that expertise and to create the kind of documents, guidelines, and this kind of thing that are needed.
Yeah, there's a good differentiation. Actually, I hadn't thought of that ultimately, like, you're the coordination, and it's the management of the subgroups and the experience that's there. And that's actually a conversation I'm due to have with one of the manufacturers actually in the next few weeks. Is this the enormous amount of knowledge that's actually in industry, and how we can bring that to bear more effectively? Because it's a huge. And everybody understands the risks, or the perceived risks, even, of industry being involved in research or policy and so on. There's always that lobbying element to it, and I think that's well understood. But at the same time, there's an unbelievable amount of knowledge and experience in industry that can be brought to bear far better than it currently is, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's maybe, of course, we've had bad experiences with industry, getting involved in lobbying and this kind of things, and corrupt politicians. And so I understand the impulse, but I think it's a little bit of a caricature, really, because at the end of the day, these people are in it for the right reasons, right? They are just HVAC experts, and they're committed to that, and they want to make HVAC technologies that deliver real value, and they have to create a business case for the customer, and that's at the end of the day what drives business. And I think also we have a unique culture of sort of responsible business. This is something that I noticed a lot. Maybe that comes as a surprise to some people, but when you talk to people in this industry, they are really committed to making a difference, right? For sustainability, for instance, because HVAC it's like a huge lever, right? As we discussed, something like 40% of all energy in Europe is consumed in buildings, and a significant part of that is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And so if we can do that better, if we can do that more efficiently, that can make a real difference. And I think there's absolutely no doubt that the industry, the companies in this industry, the people who work for those companies, they have a real commitment to sustainability and to make the world a better place. And that sounds naive, but I think they're just human beings, and we have children and grandchildren, and I think we recognize more than anyone that HVAC technologies have a role to play in sort of creating a better built environment, a more sustainable and a more healthy built environment.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. That I have to say, I'm conflicted there. I've seen both sides of that, right? And we've seen the extremes with things like Grenfell of how bad it can go with industry, right? And it's a slippery slope. And I think the challenge here is to create conditions where you can have the input of industry and lean into the enormous expertise, but with an awareness that sometimes commercial activity doesn't align with something like safety or with something else, right? That there can be a deviation, but that can be managed, and I think if you understand that, you'll find. I had this conversation. I remember back when the Grenfell inquiry was happening, and there was some pretty shocking emails that were being described about the activities of certain companies. And the overwhelming sense I had was that I recognized some of those conversations. There's a frustration in industry often that legislation isn't moving fast enough, or there's a barrier of a particular rule that makes no sense to our particular technology and is limiting a perfectly good technology from making a positive impact. And, so the way industry works is, how do we work around, what are the things we can do to work around this? Not necessarily in a negative way, but we need to progress the technology, the sales of a product and so on. And how do you get from that natural inclination to keep the wheels moving of industry to a point where you're completely ignoring fire safety and the lives of people in a building, right? And you don't go from A to B. There's a slippery slope of culture within a business and management that gets you from here to there. And how do you recognize that and cut that off at the right time? Because there will always be blockers, legislative blockers. There will always be rules that don't make sense for a particular technology. There'll always be a particular market that is obstructive to a particular approach, and industry will always try and find ways to open that market up. That's its job, right? It exists to sell. How you create those mechanisms, I think, is really fascinating. It's not a conversation for now, but I think it's really interesting that when you speak to the technical people and the people that are involved in the development of products and what have you, overwhelmingly, there's this knowledge and expertise in those companies that just seems to me to be untapped often in a lot of cases. And throughout the organization, a real willingness to help an industry move forward. And I think we've got to find better ways. And I think that's one of the advantages of Eurovent, is it covers such a big market that it's a great mechanism for tapping into that inherent knowledge and willingness to help a market and open it up. And we've seen, you've done fascinating things, I know, through the certification grouping about looking at the energy performance of ventilation systems and the impact of different ventilation types on the outcomes of indoor environmental quality and energy at the same time, and creating tools. Like, that wouldn't happen if industry wasn't prepared to put its shoulder behind the wheel and help develop that stuff, would it?
And the whole point also behind the certification is precisely to create this kind of confidence, right? Where industry can hold each other to account, because often, these kind of shortcuts, it's done by a few companies, a few bad apples, if you like. And if we can create systems to hold each other to account and to create confidence, that what the manufacturer declares in terms of the performance of the product, etc., is really what you're going to get. That's the whole idea behind certification, right? And it's independent for a reason, right? So we are based in Brussels. The certification is based in Paris. It's sort of at arm's length, and it has its own governance structures to make sure that the decisions are impartial, and you only get certification because you jump through all the hoops, right? And you had your product tested, and you did the factory audit, and you had your selection software audited, and your website and your brochures were checked to make sure that you don't claim anything which is not verified by independent testing. And we are really committed to creating these kind of mechanisms to create the confidence so that the people who prescribe the equipment or who buy the equipment know that they are getting what they paid for.
And what do you think the value of Eurovent's more global perspective is bringing to that conversation now? Because I think nothing opens the eyes to the art of the possible and the challenges that we face in certain sectors than having a much more global perspective on what's going on. You know, the challenges in it, you mentioned India. You know, India's got enormous potential, but huge challenges at the same time. There's so many lessons that can be translated and transferred in both directions from those markets. I'm guessing that is having a real impact on Eurovent's value that it can give to both its members and the marketplace, is this more global perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at India, for instance, as we discussed earlier, they are building a lot. There's a lot of technology demand, and but it's a market that works in a very different way than it does in Europe, right? It's much more cost driven, and there are just maybe there's less awareness about life cycle thinking and these kind of things. That you don't just look at the upfront cost, but you try to sort of model the cost over the whole life cycle of the equipment, and to think about sustainability as well, and to think about indoor air quality. And this is, I mean, it's a market that has a lot of potential, but it's also, they have a lot of expertise, right? And they have a lot of fantastic engineers in India, and there's a lot of, they have their own way of doing things, but it's different from how it's done in Europe. But in fact, maybe we have something to learn about them in some cases as well. And I think it's very important to exchange this kind of information, that we don't sort of work in silos, because at the end of the day, it's a global market. And these products travel the world, and they are manufactured, for instance, in Europe, but they're sold across the globe. And so we have to learn about building practices and system design practices in other parts of the world. And that's what we're trying to do with Eurovent Middle East and Eurovent India and in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, really interesting. And you mentioned the kind of circularity and embodied carbon thing there again. I mean, that was definitely one thing I wanted to touch base with you on. From my days in the industry, I was there probably at the early stages of the awareness of having to really start thinking about the circularity of the supply chain. But it's an area I haven't been deeply involved in now for probably well over half a decade. What's your sense of where the HVAC industry is now on that journey of embodied carbon, circularity, scope 3 emissions, really getting a handle on the full picture of the products?
I think it's one of the most important priorities at the moment. So I mentioned earlier that we're moving from sort of an energy performance of buildings directive to a sustainable building directive. And one of the things that the new EPBD, one of the new provisions is about the embodied carbon in the building, right? That there will be new requirements for new buildings to calculate the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon. And that has implications for all the products that go into the building, including the HVAC systems. Because at the end of the day, if you want to calculate the embodied carbon of the building, you have to just sum up the embodied carbon of everything that goes into the building, as well as the construction, etc. And so that means that HVAC manufacturers, they have to document the environmental impacts of their products over the whole life cycle. And they do that it's a document that's called an environmental product declaration, an EPD. You can imagine like a table that documents for each life cycle of the product, the environmental impacts across a range of environmental categories, impact categories, so carbon, but also things like human toxicity, eutrophication, these kind of things. And this is, it's a lot of our attention is going to this at the moment, because the challenge is that we don't have a harmonized way of doing that. It's not that we don't have standards, it's that we have too many standards and they don't agree with each other on how to do this. And so we are spending a lot of time trying to harmonize this so that there is one way to do it, and you can create, let's say, confidence that the data that the manufacturer declares is accurate.
Yeah, and for listeners that haven't kind of looked into that, one of the unique challenges of HVAC, let's just take ventilation as a simple example, is where do you draw the boundary conditions of an energy or an environmental product declaration? Are you looking at just the say, for example, it's the fan that you make, but what about the distribution system? Are you going to include that? Do you include the terminals and the vents in the room themselves? How do how do you create, you know, what's described under an environmental product declaration, and what's the procedure? Now, what are the rules that you're taking? What are the embodied carbon values that you're using uniformly across the industry? One of the interesting things was Eurovent was one of the first to do that. I mean, I think Eurovent were involved in the first of the kind of the ventilation EPDs back 15 years ago almost, I think, when they were starting to look at basic system types, MVHR and MEV. They were the first kind of EPDs to come out, I think, and Eurovent were involved in that from the very early stages. So you've seen this develop over quite a long time. Is there now a really big concerted effort amongst the sector as a whole to really get their head around this?
Yeah, so I think in the past it was sort of in pockets. So there are countries that are more advanced on this than others, like in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in France. And also a lot of it was driven by market demand for like these building certification schemes. But now it's becoming mandatory. From 2030 onwards, all new buildings will have to calculate the life cycle global warming potential, so let's say the embodied carbon and the operational carbon, and that means that it's no longer optional, and it's going to come for everyone, let's say everywhere, in a way that it wasn't before. And it's important to harmonize so that you can really you can start to compare different products in the same building context, so that you can select the most sustainable option, because that's the whole idea behind it, right? We don't just want to report numbers for the sake of reporting, but we want to enable customers to make more sustainable choices so that we reduce the environmental impacts of the building. And there's a lot of questions, as you mentioned, that have to be answered before we're there, because at the moment it's a mess.
And if you kind of work this through logically, I mean, to kind of demystify the idea, I mean, really what you're looking for is to, like you say, be able to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. And for at the moment, that's very hard to do. But if you want people that are making decisions about spaces to be able to objectively say, well, look, you know, I'm prepared to put in a slightly less efficient something because actually over its lifetime, the embodied carbon of that approach makes more sense for this type of a building. They can't make those kind of decisions if they don't have the information in front of them. That's the challenge. And you see that being played out across the entire sector. You know, something as simple as insulation, say, you might say, well, look, this has a better U value, but a higher embodied carbon. If I'm going to make the decision on those trade-offs, I need reliable information in front of me to make them. You know, likewise, if you want to put an MVHR system into a home, but there's a embodied carbon impact of that versus a unidirectional system, that in order for you to be able to make that decision for that building, you need that information. And at the moment, that's quite hard to do. It's really interesting to see that that's still happening, that that there's a lot of momentum, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered. What do you think what are the big things that you're trying to resolve there at the moment when it comes to EPDs?
I think it's the standard that we're going to use in order to do this work.
Yeah.
So there are two main standards. One is for construction products, and the other is for electronic equipment, and they don't agree with each other exactly on. I mean, this is quite technical. It has to do like with cutoff rules and how do you deal with benefits beyond the system boundary. It's very technical, but there is not one way of doing it, and so we just need to harmonize it. And the thing is, it's going to become mandatory for buildings, but we're also expecting this to become mandatory for products. So under another piece of legislation that we haven't talked about yet, which is eco-design. So we have the eco-design directive and the eco-design for sustainable products regulation. Today, the focus has been almost exclusively on the energy performance of the products, but we are also seeing we see an increased attention to circularity, repairability, recyclability, material choices, and we are also expecting requirements on the products in terms of having to calculate the environmental footprints over the full life cycle of the product, and not just the energy performance. And the thing is, it's not rocket science. It's not hard to do, but we just need to have one standard way of doing it. And because there are vested interests, you can imagine that it's not easy to do.
Yeah, vested interests, and lots of different countries with different ideas as well. Like that's the trouble with the European bloc, always has been, is getting everybody to agree on anything is the biggest challenge. Which just kind of brings us all the way back full circle to the beginning of, these things are imperfect and are going to be in a constant state of revision. What's your kind of hope for the next 5 years, Stijn, of this sector, the HVAC sector? If you were kind of projecting 5 years in advance, what would good look like to you from where we are today?
Well, I think there's a lot of focus on sustainability, and I think that really is the key word. But I think we have to think of sustainability holistically, right? Sustainability is not just energy, and it's not just carbon. Like a sustainable building is a healthy building, a sustainable building is an affordable building, and all these things have to come together. And I think if we can create this sort of holistic vision of what sustainable looks like and what a sustainable building is, and we can merge all these things together, then as an industry, we can start to develop the solutions and the technologies that are going to enable that. And there's, I think, a lot of work to be done in terms of, the legislation, the legislative framework, the standards for defining all of this thing. And I think that good would mean an industry which is growing, which is innovating, and which is contributing to a more sustainable future. And that's the commitment that we have as an industry, is that we want to be proactive and we want to be part of the solution, and we want to achieve the net zero targets, and we want to deliver the technologies that are going to enable that. But there's a lot of work to be done in terms of, defining what we're talking about and making sure that we have the competence to do that, and that we have the legislative framework, and that, the bad actors are being held to account. So that's a little bit the hope for the future, I would say.
Yeah, and talking to you, I get a real sense that there's a real motivation in the industry to do that there's a lot of energy to do the right thing and really progress this. It just needs the chance to do it. Like we say, all the lights are green. We just need it to happen.
Yeah, we need the enabling conditions, but the will is absolutely there. And our industry understands itself to be part of the solution.
Yeah. Stijn, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Thanks so much for your time this morning. I think it's a really fascinating look at the European context, because we look at the context globally here on the podcast, both the US and in Asia and the global south. And I think it's really interesting to get a sense of where we are from a European perspective and how industry is looking at this sector, and how an organization like yours that represents so much of that is what its worldview is. So thanks so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes: Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.